Every evening, as the sun began to set, a young girl was often seen sitting alone in the same quiet playground. The park, which was usually empty after dark, became her place of comfort, a refuge from a world she didn't quite understand. The swings creaked in the cool breeze, and the dim streetlights cast long shadows, but she didn't mind. To her, the playground was the only place that felt safe, where no one would judge her, and where she could escape from the harsh realities of her life. Her name was Maya, and though she was just 12 years old, she had already seen more pain than many adults could imagine. Her clothes were worn and frayed at the edges, as though they had been through too many washing machines. She would wear the same jacket every night, which had patches where the fabric had started to unravel. It didn't matter to her. She didn't have anyone who cared to notice. Most people in the neighborhood didn't know her story. They'd pass by, seeing her sitting there, but no one ever stopped to ask. Some thought she was just a lonely child. Others thought she was waiting for someone. But the truth was far different. Maya wasn't waiting for anyone. She didn't have a family to go home to. No warm bed, no roof over her head. Every night was the same. She'd sit on the swings and stare at the sky, wondering where her life had gone wrong. It had been months since she had found this spot. At first, she had wandered the streets, unsure of where to go. The shelters she tried had never worked out for long. They were full of people, loud and crowded, and no matter how hard she tried, she never felt like she belonged. So she had chosen the park, where she could stay hidden, and no one would question her. She spent her nights lying on the cold ground near the jungle gym, wrapping herself tightly in the thin blanket she had stolen from an old dumpster. Sometimes she would fall asleep, only to wake up in the middle of the night with the sound of footsteps approaching. She would always freeze, holding her breath, hoping the stranger wouldn't notice her, praying they would just walk by. On the rare occasion that someone did stop to talk, she would say she was just waiting for her mom or dad. She didn't want anyone to know that she was alone. She didn't want pity or kindness, because she didn't know how to handle it. She had learned long ago that when people saw her as a sad, lonely girl, it only made things worse. So Maya kept to herself, trying her best to hide the fear and sadness that consumed her heart. One evening, as she sat on the swing, her legs pushing the seat gently back and forth, a car slowed down as it passed by. Maya didn't notice at first, too lost in her thoughts. But as the car came to a stop, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel and the sound of a door opening. She quickly looked up, her heart racing. A man in a uniform stepped out of the vehicle, and for the first time in a long while, Maya felt a surge of fear. She wasn't used to people coming this close to her. The man wasn't looking at her with the usual coldness or indifference. He was looking at her with curiosity, like he could see something deeper. It was Officer Harris, and he couldn't help but wonder what a young girl was doing alone in the park at this time of night. As Officer Harris stepped closer to the swings, Maya's heart skipped a beat. She instinctively pulled her legs up to her chest and hugged her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her mind raced, thinking of every possible way to escape if she needed to. The last thing she wanted was for someone to ask questions she didn't have answers to. But the officer didn't approach her in a way that made her feel threatened. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though he understood the importance of not startling her. "Hey there," Officer Harris said gently, his voice calm and friendly. Maya glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of caution and curiosity. She didn't speak at first, unsure of how to respond. People didn't usually talk to her unless they had something to say, something that didn't always feel kind. But the officer didn't look like he was here to lecture her. There was something in his face, something soft and understanding, that made her hesitate before turning away. "Are you okay?" the officer asked. His eyes scanned the playground, as if he was unsure what to make of the situation himself. Maya didn't respond right away. She didn't want to tell them the truth. She didn't want to admit that she had nowhere to go, nowhere to call home. She shifted uneasily on the swing, staring down at her worn shoes. She wished he would just leave her alone. so she could go back to her solitude. But instead, the officer crouched down so that he was eye level with her, making an effort to appear less imposing. "You shouldn't be out here this late by yourself," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "Do you need help?" Maya shook her head quickly, trying to hide the pain in her eyes. She didn't need help. She had survived on her own for so long, hadn't she? But Officer Harris wasn't backing down. He waited patiently, giving her the space to speak if she wanted to. She could feel his gaze on her, gentle but unyielding. It made her feel exposed, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of the swings. Then Maya finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine. Just waiting for someone." The lie felt empty as soon as it left her lips. It wasn't the first time she had used it, but it was easier than explaining the truth, easier than telling him that there was no one waiting for her, that she had no family to return to. The officer didn't seem convinced. His expression softened, and he glanced around the park, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was putting pieces of a puzzle together. "It's a bit late for someone to be picking you up, don't you think?" he said gently, his tone still calm. Maya bit her lip, not sure how to respond. She felt trapped. This officer wasn't like the others she had met. He wasn't judging her. And that made everything harder. The truth was starting to feel like it wanted to spill out of her, but she wasn't ready. She didn't know this man, and she didn't want to trust him. Seeing her hesitation, Officer Harris took a step back, giving her space. "Look, I'm just worried about you. I know things can get tough, but there are people who can help. You don't have to be out here alone." Maya's eyes flickered up to meet his. There was a hint of something in her chest, a small spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the kindness in his voice, or maybe it was the way he was trying so hard to make her feel safe. But she wasn't ready to take that step yet. Not yet. She just nodded slightly, unwilling to say more. For a long while, Officer Harris didn't push further. He just stood there, quietly watching her, as if waiting for her to decide whether she wanted to open up or not. Maya turned her gaze back to the empty playground, the swings swaying in the breeze, the shadows stretching across the ground. It felt like another night, the same as all the others. But something about this time felt different, like maybe someone truly cared. The following evening, Officer Harris returned to the playground. His mind had been heavy with thoughts of the girl he had met the night before. He had seen many troubled youths in his line of work, but something about Maya's situation stayed with him. Her story felt incomplete, and it wasn't just her loneliness that made him uneasy. There was something deeper, something unspoken, in the way she carried herself, in the way she tried so hard not to let anyone in. He didn't want to push her. He didn't want to invade her space, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, and he couldn't ignore it. His job was to protect people, especially those who needed help, and he couldn't just walk away without trying to make a difference in her life. As he drove into the parking lot of the park, he spotted Maya almost immediately. She was sitting on the same swing as before, her legs pushed slightly outward, barely moving. The park was eerily quiet once again, the streetlights casting long shadows over the empty benches and paths. Officer Harris pulled over and parked his car, this time stepping out with a little more purpose in his movements. Maya noticed him as he approached, her gaze lifting to meet his. She didn't flinch this time, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She had learned to expect the unexpected, but she didn't know what to make of this officer yet. It wasn't like other encounters she had with strangers. Most people had passed her by without a second thought. But this man, Officer Harris, had been different. He had been patient. He hadn't pushed her too hard. "Hey," Officer Harris called out gently as he got closer, not wanting to startle her. He didn't want to make her think he was an authority figure trying to scold her. Instead, he wanted to be someone who could offer help, someone who wasn't here to make her feel small. Maya didn't respond at first, but she didn't look away either. She seemed like she was thinking, as though weighing her options in her mind. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I told you. I'm waiting for someone," she said, not quite meeting his gaze. The words felt rehearsed, like she had said them so many times that they were no longer a lie, just something she said to keep herself safe. Officer Harris wasn't convinced, but he didn't push her. Instead, he sat down on a bench a few feet away, still keeping a respectful distance. He didn't want to make her feel cornered. "I get that," he said calmly, looking out at the swings as if the answer wasn't important to him. "But I can't just leave you out here by yourself. It's not safe, especially at night." He hesitated, then added softly, "I want to help you." Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she still didn't speak. She didn't know how to trust someone, not like this. She didn't know how to accept help when she wasn't sure if she even deserved it. People had come and gone in her life, and each time, it had hurt. People always left. She didn't want to open herself up only for it to be taken away again. "Look," Officer Harris continued, his voice still gentle, "I'm not here to judge you. I just want to make sure you're okay. I know things must be tough. If you want, I can get you some help, or even just a safe place to stay for the night. You don't have to be out here." Maya stayed silent for a while, not sure how to respond. She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, fear, hope, and a deep sadness she didn't know how to express. She wanted to tell him everything, to spill out all the hurt she had been carrying, but she couldn't. It wasn't that simple. Finally, after a long pause, she let out a shaky breath, and almost without realizing it, spoke. "I don't want to go to a shelter. I don't fit in there." Her voice cracked as she admitted it, but she quickly looked down at her hands, ashamed of her vulnerability. Officer Harris nodded, as if he understood. "I get it," he said quietly. "Shelters can be overwhelming. But there are other options, Maya. You don't have to be out here alone." Maya looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His kindness wasn't something she knew how to process. She had learned to keep people at arm's length, but there was something about this officer, something about the way he spoke that made her want to trust him, even just a little. "I'll think about it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Harris gave a small, understanding smile. "Take your time, but just know you're not alone. If you need anything, I'm here." As he stood up to leave, Maya watched him walk back to his car. A part of her wanted to call out, to ask for help, but she stayed silent. There was a small spark of hope inside her, one that she wasn't ready to admit to herself yet. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone after all. The next few days felt different for Maya. The playground no longer felt like her only refuge. Officer Harris had planted a seed in her mind, one that she wasn't sure she wanted to water, but it had been growing nonetheless. It was a small seed, the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who cared enough to help her. But at the same time, the thought terrified her. Opening up meant exposing her weaknesses, and she had spent so much of her life building walls to protect herself. Letting someone in was too risky, too vulnerable. She spent her days in the park, sitting on the same swing, watching people pass by. There was always a sense of being watched, a feeling of isolation in the middle of everything. It was as though the world around her was moving in a way that she couldn't keep up with. She was stuck, alone, and yet there was something new, something small and fragile, that made her hesitate to push away the thought of change. On the fourth day, Maya decided to take a different path. She had left the park in the morning, walking aimlessly through the neighborhood. She didn't have anywhere to go, but for once, she didn't mind. She was letting her feet lead her, just going wherever the streets took her. As she passed by the old bookstore, she saw a group of children playing in the yard of a nearby house. They were laughing and running around without a care in the world. For a moment, Maya stood still and watched them, her heart aching with the thought that she could never be like them. As she continued walking, her mind kept drifting back to Officer Harris and his offer to help her. He had been kind, but she had barely said a word to him. She had shut him out the moment she had felt the sting of hope. She wasn't sure if she was ready to accept his help, but something inside her had shifted. The idea of safety, of not being alone anymore, seemed like a dream she didn't think she could have. But why not? Why couldn't she have a chance at something better? Around dusk, when the sun started to dip behind the horizon, Maya found herself back at the playground. She hadn't planned on coming back here, but somehow her feet had taken her there, as though the park still held some sense of comfort. As she approached the swings, she saw Officer Harris' patrol car parked nearby. He wasn't in it, but he had left the car running with the door slightly ajar, just as though he was expecting someone. Maya's pulse quickened, and for a moment, she considered turning around and leaving. She didn't want to face him, not yet, but something in her wouldn't let her walk away. She hesitated, then took a slow step toward the swings. It wasn't just the fear of being alone anymore. She had been alone for too long, and it had only made things worse. The weight of her loneliness had started to feel unbearable, like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. Just as she approached the swings, she heard a voice call out softly from behind her. "Maya." She turned, startled, and saw Officer Harris standing near the park's entrance. He wasn't wearing his uniform this time. His expression was warm, yet serious, as though he could sense her hesitation. "Hey," he said gently, his voice calm and patient. "I didn't expect you to come back here, but I'm glad you did." Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. I didn't know where else to go," she admitted quietly, looking down at the ground. She hadn't meant to say those words, but they slipped out before she could stop them. Officer Harris gave her a small nod, as if he understood more than she had realized. "You don't have to keep running away, you know," he said, his voice carrying a sense of care that Maya hadn't heard before. "You don't have to face this alone." She looked up at him, her heart racing. The words he spoke felt like a lifeline. She didn't know how to ask for help, but somehow his presence was making it feel a little easier. I don't know what to do," she whispered, the weight of her own uncertainty heavy on her shoulders. "I don't know if I can trust you." Officer Harris's face softened, his eyes filled with understanding. He stepped forward but didn't crowd her. "Trust takes time, Maya," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm just offering you a chance for something better." Maya looked at him for a long moment, the confusion and fear still lingering in her mind. But deep down, something inside her was beginning to soften. Maybe she didn't have to face everything alone. Maybe this could be the start of something different. With a hesitant breath, she finally nodded. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice small but with just a hint of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. And for the first time, she didn't feel as alone as she had before. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty for Maya. The conversation with Officer Harris had left her mind spinning, and she wasn't sure how to process the idea of accepting his help. She had spent so long fending for herself, learning to trust no one, and now someone was offering her something she had never dared to hope for, a chance at safety, at not being alone. But what if it didn't work out? What if she ended up worse than before? She couldn't risk it. Yet, every night, as she lay awake on the cold ground of the playground, the thought of having a real home, a place where she didn't have to worry about finding food or a roof over her head, gnawed at her. It felt like a dream, one that she was afraid to believe could come true. One evening, as the sun began to set, Maya found herself once again in the familiar park, her feet taking her there without thought. She didn't want to go back to the playground, but something pulled her in. She spotted Officer Harris's patrol car parked by the entrance, and this time, she didn't turn away. It was as though her feet were leading her there without her permission, like she was being drawn to a place of possibility. She paused for a moment, unsure whether she was ready for another conversation. Her emotions were tangled. A part of her was still afraid of trusting too much, afraid of letting herself believe that people could care for her. But the other part, the part that longed for something better, was telling her that maybe it was time to take a chance. As she approached the swings, she saw Officer Harris leaning against the fence, waiting. When he noticed her walking toward him, he straightened up, offering her a warm, encouraging smile. "Maya," he greeted softly, as if he had known all along that she would come back. "I've been thinking," Maya said, her voice hesitant but determined. She had made a decision, though she wasn't sure how to put it into words. "About what you said. About trusting you." Officer Harris nodded, waiting patiently for her to continue. He didn't rush her, giving her the space she needed to find the right words. "I don't know if I can trust you completely," Maya admitted, looking down at the ground, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "But I think I'm ready to try. I don't want to be alone anymore." There was a pause before Officer Harris responded, his expression softening with understanding. He knew that what she was saying wasn't easy for her. He could see the walls she had built around herself, walls that had protected her for so long. He could see how much it meant for her to let them come down, even just a little. "You don't have to do this alone, Maya," he said gently, taking a step closer without invading her personal space. "I can help you. You're not a burden. And you're not alone anymore." Maya's throat tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope. She had spent so much of her life keeping people at arm's length, hiding the pain, hiding the fear. But now, standing in front of Officer Harris, she realized that she didn't have to carry the weight by herself. "I don't know where to start," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can believe this is real." "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," Officer Harris replied with a reassuring smile. "You just have to take the first step, one day at a time." Maya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be simple, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making a choice for herself. A choice to be more than just a girl in a playground, more than just someone trying to survive. A choice to start living again. "I'll try," she said, her voice steadier than it had been before. "I'll try to trust you." Officer Harris smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Maya feel as if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in the world after all. "That's all I ask," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm here whenever you're ready." And for the first time in a long time, Maya believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her beyond the playground. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Maya. What started as a small decision to trust Officer Harris had quickly begun to feel like a turning point in her life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of the past seemed unbearable, and when Maya felt like running away from it all. But Officer Harris had been consistent, always there with a kind word or a simple gesture to reassure her that she wasn't alone anymore. Officer Harris had arranged for Maya to stay at a nearby shelter for the night, just to give her a safe place away from the park. At first, Maya had hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could handle the crowded environment of a shelter. She had seen too many of them before, places that promised safety but always left her feeling more isolated. But this time, something felt different. The shelter wasn't like the others. It was quieter, and the people there were kind and understanding. She had her own little corner where she could sit and think, a place where she wasn't being judged. After her first night there, Maya began to open up, little by little. The staff at the shelter were patient with her, letting her take things at her own pace. They didn't ask too many questions at once or try to push her into talking about her past. They simply let her exist, which was exactly what she needed. Each morning, Maya would wake up to the sound of others talking in the kitchen, the smell of breakfast filling the air. It was strange at first, hearing so many voices and knowing that people cared enough to feed her, to make sure she was okay. She was still getting used to the idea of not having to fend for herself. The walls she had built around her started to feel less necessary. She could let her guard down, at least a little. But even though the shelter was a place of safety, Maya still couldn't shake the feeling that she was in a foreign land, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Every time someone smiled at her, she had to remind herself that not all people were out to hurt her. It was a difficult lesson, one she had been taught to unlearn over the years. It was going to take time for her to trust again fully. One afternoon, a few days after she had started staying at the shelter, Officer Harris stopped by. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was a comfort. When he walked through the door, Maya could feel the familiar sense of safety that he had offered her the first time they met. He had come to check on her, to see how she was doing. "Hey, Maya," he greeted with a smile. "How's everything going?" She glanced up from the book she had been reading, surprised to see him. "It's okay," she replied softly, looking down at her hands. She wasn't sure how to put it into words. Things were better, but it felt like she was still floating, unsure of where she was going. Officer Harris sat down across from her, giving her space. He could tell she wasn't quite ready to share everything, and he respected that. "That's good to hear," he said, his voice gentle. "You've been through a lot, and it's okay to take it one step at a time." Maya nodded but didn't say anything more. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling. Everything was so new, so overwhelming. But at the same time, there was a quiet sense of hope inside her that she hadn't felt in years. She didn't have to carry the weight of everything by herself anymore. After a moment of silence, Officer Harris stood up to leave. Before he walked out the door, he turned to Maya and gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing great," he said, "and whenever you need to talk, or if you need anything, I'm here." His words, simple as they were, meant more to her than she could say. For the first time in a long while, Maya felt like she wasn't fighting the world alone. She didn't have to hide in the shadows anymore. There was a small light inside her that was beginning to shine a little brighter. That night, as Maya lay in her bed of the shelter, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was the start of something better. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like it could be something worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, Maya began to adjust to her new life. It wasn't an easy transition, but with every passing day, she felt a little less like the scared, lonely girl who had once spent her nights in the playground. Little by little, the idea of safety and stability started to feel more real. She still carried the weight of her past with her, but she no longer felt trapped by it. There were moments when she would feel a familiar ache in her chest, a longing for the family she had lost, but those moments were fewer now. She was learning that maybe family wasn't just about blood. It could be the people who cared enough to help you when you couldn't help yourself. At the shelter, Maya began to make small connections. She didn't speak much to the other kids at first, still unsure of how to open up, but she started to notice the warmth in their smiles. There was a girl named Emma who had been at the shelter for a while. She was a little older than Maya, and seemed to have a quiet confidence that Maya envied. Emma was always kind, always offering her a seat at the table when it was time for meals, always checking in to see if Maya was okay. It was Emma who encouraged Maya to join in activities. At first, Maya resisted. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to be noticed. But one day, after Emma invited her to join a drawing class, Maya decided to try. The activity was simple, just sketching what they saw around the room. But for Maya, it felt like a revelation. She had always loved to draw, but had never had the chance to explore it. As she picked up the pencil and began to sketch, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease. It was as if, for a moment, she could forget everything else and just be herself. Officer Harris continued to check in on her, always kind, always patient. Maya hadn't realized how much she had missed feeling cared for until he started showing up regularly, offering simple words of encouragement. He never pushed her, never made her feel like she was obligated to talk. He simply showed up, a steady presence in a world that had been anything but steady for her. His visits were brief, but they meant more to Maya than she could explain. Every time he smiled at her, she felt a little more at ease, a little more like she could trust him. One afternoon, Maya was sitting on a bench outside the shelter, her legs stretched out before her as she watched the birds flutter around. She had just finished a book that had captivated her, a story about a girl who had overcome all odds to find a place where she truly belonged. Maya closed the book and sighed. It was hard for her to imagine a life like that, a life where she could truly feel at home, but she was beginning to wonder if it was possible. As she sat there, Emma walked up to her with a soft smile. "You doing okay?" she asked, sitting down beside Maya. Maya shrugged but gave a small smile in return. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, sometimes, I still don't know what I'm doing here." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's hard at first, but you're here, and that's the important part. You're making it." Maya looked down at her hands, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. "I just don't know if I can ever go back to feeling like I'm enough, like I deserve to be here." "You already are," Emma said firmly. "You don't need to be perfect to belong. You just need to be you." Maya felt her chest tighten as Emma's words sank in. She had spent so long hiding, so long believing she wasn't worthy of kindness or love. But Emma's simple words made her realize something important. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect. Maybe she just needed to keep going, one step at a time. That evening, Maya stood in front of the mirror in the shelter's common room, staring at her reflection. She had never liked what she saw before, never felt like she measured up. But tonight, there was something different. She wasn't the same girl who had wandered the streets, hiding from the world. She had found a place to belong, even if it was small, and that meant more than she had ever realized. Later, as Officer Harris came to check on her, Maya was ready to speak. She had never been able to express herself before, but tonight, something had shifted inside her. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "For everything. For believing in me." Officer Harris looked surprised, but his smile was warm and full of pride. "You did it, Maya," he said softly. "You're the one who made the choice to change. I'm just happy to be part of your journey." Maya didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, she was starting to believe that it could be something worth looking forward to. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she could finally start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The days grew longer, and with each passing week, Maya felt like she was shedding the weight of the past little by little. The park, once her only refuge, no longer held the same hold on her. She wasn't running to it every night to escape. Instead, she spent her days at the shelter, starting to build a new routine, one that didn't feel so lonely. The people around her, like Emma and the shelter staff, were starting to feel like a second family, and she could finally breathe without the constant ache of fear and uncertainty. Officer Harris had become a steady presence in her life. He stopped by often, never pushing her but always offering the quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. Maya had learned to trust him, though she still couldn't completely open up about everything that had happened. There were parts of her past she wasn't ready to revisit, but she didn't need to. He never asked for more than she was willing to share. His respect for her space and his patience were exactly what she needed. One evening, as she was sitting outside with Emma, the cool breeze carrying the scent of autumn, Officer Harris approached them. Maya looked up and saw that he was holding something in his hand. When he reached them, he smiled and handed Maya a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "A little something for you," Officer Harris said, his tone warm. "I thought you might like it." Maya's heart fluttered nervously. She had never been one to receive gifts, especially not from someone like him. She slowly unwrapped the paper, revealing a small sketchbook and a set of colored pencils. Maya stared at the gift, speechless. She had always loved to draw, but she hadn't had the chance to do so much since arriving at the shelter. It was a simple gift, but it meant more to her than she could express. "I remember you told me you liked drawing," Officer Harris said softly. "I thought this might help." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. She hadn't expected this, didn't know how to react to such a thoughtful gesture. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot to me." Officer Harris gave her a small smile. "You deserve it, Maya. You're doing great. You've come so far, and I know you're capable of even more." Maya's chest tightened as she took the sketchbook into her hands. She could feel the weight of it, its potential. It was as if Officer Harris was telling her, without words, that it was okay to dream again. It was okay to think about a future that was brighter, one where she didn't have to be defined by her past struggles. Over the next few days, Maya spent time drawing, filling the pages with her thoughts and emotions. She began with simple sketches, things she saw around the shelter, like the flowers in the garden or the birds flying above. But soon, her drawings began to take on more depth. She drew her dreams, the things she wished for, but had been afraid to ask for: a family, a home, peace. With every stroke of the pencil, she felt a little more like herself, like the girl who had long ago forgotten how to hope. One afternoon, as she was finishing a drawing of the sunset, Emma came over and peered at the page. "That's beautiful, Maya," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Maya looked up at Emma, a shy smile on her face. "Thanks. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time. I just never thought I could." Emma sat down next to her. "You can do anything you set your mind to. You've already come so far." Maya's smile grew, and for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of herself. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she didn't belong, like she wasn't worth anyone's time. But now, surrounded by people who cared for her and supported her, Maya realized that she was worthy of a future filled with possibility. That night, as she sat in her room at the shelter, Maya looked down at her sketchbook and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had made it this far. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but she had made it. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She wasn't just waiting for someone to come and save her. She had saved herself. The future was still uncertain, and there would be challenges ahead, but Maya was no longer afraid of them. She had people who cared, a passion for drawing that she was ready to explore, and a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. As she closed her sketchbook for the night, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, she knew that it was a road worth walking. And this time, she wouldn't be walking alone.